My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So I've been visiting Michigan a whole lot more often recently. I'm trying to get used to Michigan traffic and roundabouts and roads. And as I was coming here, it reminded me of our discussion actually, a discussion surrounding piety. For so many of us, even if you grew up in a very practicing household, a conservative household maybe even if you grew up as a part of the Muslim fabric of the community, there is a defining moment in our youthful years, which we'll all hold on to so dearly. There's a point of time when we choose to say, I am no longer inherently Muslim. I am no longer haphazardly Muslim. I am no longer Muslim by chance, but I am a Muslim because I believe in Islam. And that moment is phenomenal. It's incredible. Sometimes it happens in your car ride back from the masjid. Sometimes it happens when no one is around you, you're on campus, and you know that you could go to a place, engage in something, maybe digest a substance, whatever the case may be, but do something that contradicts the moral compass of Islam, and you hold yourself back from doing that. And you're like, you know what? This is me choosing Islam. And it begins by choosing Islam in small practices, going out of your way to pray in an environment that lacks prayer, going out of your way to dress modestly in a society that pushes back on dressing modestly, going out of your way to have healthy relationships and dynamics with people of the same gender and the opposite gender, in a society that kind of allows a lot of that to become very blurry. Choosing these things every single day is like a conscious effort to say, yes, I'm Muslim. Yes, I'm Muslim. Yes, I'm Muslim. And that choice is phenomenal. It's incredible. But the question becomes, where do I go from there? Now that I'm beyond my teens, in my young professional years, now that I know that I've chosen Islam, how do I go beyond the standard education that I got from my parents, the standard education that I got from my local imam? How do I take it to the next level, going beyond even education, but actually being a Muslim that carries Islam inside of them? And the good news is we're not the first generation to do this. For over 1,000 years, people have, like you, chosen to be pious and chosen to take a path of piety. But the difficulty that we face, my dear brothers and sisters, is that particularly in the era of Instagram, and it's not a talk that I'm giving unless I take jabs at Instagram, right? But particularly in the era of Instagram, there is particular imagery of what righteousness looks like. There's particular vibes of what it looks like to be a pious individual. These are people that dress a certain way, talk a certain way, act a particular way. And if I don't make that cut, then that's it. That means that I am not a person of piety. And the reality is that this is fundamentally contradicting with what piety looked like in an authentically Muslim society. In an authentically Muslim society, the most righteous amongst you could have been the baker. In an authentic Muslim society, the butcher man could have been your Quran teacher. In an authentic Muslim society, the one that is at the daycare center or at the school for the children might be one of the awliya of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In an authentic Muslim society, our journey to be the awliya of Allah is not determined by anyone but us. Because piety, my dear sisters and brothers, is going to look uniquely different in each and every single one of us. The time has come, my dear brothers and sisters, to dismantle those images of cliche, generic, Amazon or even Temu quality Islamic religiosity, that we think that this is cookie cutter Islam, and if I don't make that cut, that means maybe I'm just not Muslim enough. And to actually think about, here's an image of me. This is a discussion I had with some of the seeker students here. Here's an image of me, of who I am today, with all the bells and whistles, with all the bruises and brokenness. And all of us have bells and whistles, and all of us have bruises and brokenness. This is the picture of who I am. And this is a picture of who I aspire to be. This is an image of who I ought to be with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And to know that I need to carry both of these images with me. But it requires us to develop a sense of familiarity with both of these images. What are the bells and whistles that Allah Ta'ala gave me? What are the skills? What are the talents? What are the opportunities that Allah Jalla Jalaluhu afforded to me? Because very clearly and without a shadow of a doubt, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gifted that to you so you could do something with it, so you could make something of it. And so the more that we are familiar with the complete portrait of who we are now, and the more that we invest in time with our mashayikh, with the muftis, with the scholars, really trying to say, let me paint the portrait of who I want to be. Let me paint a picture of what it looks like for me to be righteous. And to begin to work towards that image. We do it with weight loss all the time, right? How many of us have downloaded and removed MyFitnessPal? How many of us have joined? Is going to end up just being me at the end of it, right? But the point is that there's so many things that we do, right, to create imagery and portraits of who we aspire to be. But it's not going to be by fighting ourselves or denying ourselves or ignoring ourselves that we become those people. It's by honoring both of those images. The images of who I am today and the image of who I am aspiring to be. And that, dear brothers and sisters, is only the beginning of a conversation on living a life of piety with purpose. It's to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has placed within you gems. As the Prophet ﷺ says, "An-nasu ma'adin." People are treasures. And you have to sift through a lot of dirt. You have to work through a lot of your trauma and drama. You got to deal with a lot of your shortcomings and mistakes in order to unpack the diamonds, the jewels, the rubies of righteousness and piety that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed inside of you. I remember growing up and hearing like those, classic Arabic forwarded messages on WhatsApp before WhatsApp, 3-year-old kid standing on the minbar, giving a khutbah, reading Quran that, none of us have memorized. And I'm like, man, low-key, khalas, that's what people of Quran look like. That's never going to be me. And I was absolutely correct, because I was never going to be 3 years old in some masjid in some faraway land, giving a khutbah and quoting poetry that I have no idea what it means. But what it was meant to do was inspire me. And I began to think, what does it look like for me to memorize the Quran? What does it look like for me to study Islam? What does it look like for me to be in gatherings like the gatherings of Thabat and Miftaah? Gatherings of camaraderie, of futuwa, of suhbah, where we come together with like-minded individuals to find faith around us enough that inspires faith inside of us. What does it look like to grow in my journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises us in the Quran, وَالَّذِينَ جَاهَدُوا فِينَا لَنَهْدِيَنَّهُمْ سُبُلَنَا. As for those who struggle and strive in their journey to Allah, Allah says He doesn't take it upon you to be guided. Allah says He takes it upon Himself to make sure you're guided. Allah wants to see you try. Allah wants to see you care. And wallahi, amongst the many crises that we're dealing with as a community, do you know why most people lack piety? Not because they don't want piety, not because they don't know that piety is the truth, but because they can't care enough. We have a crisis of carelessness in our community. And the beginning of it is learning to care about your relationship with Allah, to care about your relationship with Salah, to care about your relationship with the Prophet ﷺ, to care about your relationship with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to have a problem with the fact that you might know the same Quran that you knew when you were 6 years old. Maybe you read the same amount of Quran that you read 6 months ago or 6 years ago, or maybe even 6 days ago. But to be at a complacent level where you are okay with where you are now, my dear brothers and sisters, with full respect and love, that is a problem. If I am not trying to be at a better place with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala today, then when am I going to make that choice? To live a life of piety and purpose, it requires us to realize that the greatest generations of Islam, who we aspire to be like, they became who they were, radiyallahu ta'ala anil jamii', because they challenged themselves to be better with Allah every day. They challenged themselves to be closer to the Prophet ﷺ every day. They challenged themselves to have a better relationship with the Quran today. They challenged themselves to have a higher quality asr than they have dhuhr. How wild is that? You pray dhuhr, you go to asr, be like, man, listen, asr's got to be better than dhuhr today. You go to Maghrib, like Maghrib is an out loud prayer. I got to bust out Abdul Basit today. So every prayer becomes a challenge from the prayer before it. Every fast becomes that. And the heart, my dear brothers and sisters, no organ is worth conditioning and working out. No organ is worth working on more than our hearts. And that is where piety is found, not in the externalities, not in what we see on the outside. But where does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tell us He looks? At the heart. And that is where piety is planted. That is where piety is cultivated. It reminds me of the Prophet ﷺ and his relationship with the Sahaba. And I want to encourage this because I know I want to name an elephant in the room. And that elephant in the room is that the reality is so many of you are already considered in your societies and in your communities and maybe even in your home, you are the cream of the crop. You're the person that people may be telling their kids to be like them. And that's why we are always referring back to the dua that's within our tradition. Allahumma ighfir lana ma la ya'lamun waj'alni khayran mimma yadhunnun. Oh Allah, allow us to be better than that which people think of us. And forgive us, because low-key only Allah Ta'ala knows the realities of our heart. Right? That's why Abdullah ibn Mas'ud radiallahu ta'ala anil jami', what does Abdullah ibn Mas'ud say? He says, if my sins were manifested through a bad odor, none of you would be able to be in the same room as me. And this is Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, the one who his foot and his leg, the Prophet ﷺ says, was more valuable than an entire mountain of Uhud of goodness. If it were to be in gold, that the value of just the leg of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud would be that great in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he's saying, if my sins were manifested through an odor, none of you would bear to be in the same room as me. I say that because I know what it's like to be in communities where we are seen as the Shaykh or Shaykha, or the student of knowledge and the one that's getting things done, or mashallah, the sister that's been hijabi from day one, or the brother that mashallah had a beard before high school, which is highly impressive, by the way. But regardless of the situation, I know that some of us are those people in our homes, in our communities, and I know that that could be weaponized by shaitan against us. And we'll keep that conversation for another day, inshallah. And yet I want to highlight one thing that the Prophet ﷺ did. And that is that the Prophet ﷺ would look at people, and this is very powerful. And if you forget everything that I've said, I want you to remember this. The Prophet ﷺ would look at people and he would show them beauty and brilliance in them that they didn't even see possible. Everyone, the youngest of them, the oldest of them, the richest of them, the poorest of them, the blackest of them, the whitest of them, without any exception, the most learned of them and the most unlettered of them, the most societally clouded of them and the most societally unknown of them. The Prophet ﷺ would look at them and he would see in them, he would unpack the treasure that they couldn't even see inside of themselves. That's why I love the Prophet ﷺ so much. His ability to do that. My dear brothers and sisters, you need to be doing that with the brothers and sisters you have at home. You need to do that with that younger sibling that you have. You need to do that sometimes, honestly, with your own mom and dad. You need to do that sometimes with your uncle who doesn't pray, or your cousin that's addicted to weed. You need to show them a goodness in themselves, because in a society that tells us everything that's wrong with us, we need to let people know what's right inside of them. The potential, the beauty, the brilliance, the ma'adin, the treasures that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has placed in people. And that could be the beginning of their purpose. How many of you have come to Chicago? May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make you all from the people of Chicago. Say Ameen. So I remember I was at the Masikna convention last year. I'll end with this because God knows I'm beyond my time. Actually, I'm not beyond my time. This is going down. Okay, this is good. So a Chicago story to bring the barakah of Chicago here. I remember I was at the Masikna convention, and we all know that most people go there and spend most of their time where? Let's be honest. In the bazaar. We do tawaf 7 times a day in the bazaar, right? So I was in the bazaar. Everyone is going somewhere, but nobody knows where anybody's going, right? But of course, there's a lot of khayr that comes from those gatherings, and we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless its organizers. But I remember, like, The first mass ikna after COVID, I remember a guy came up to me when it was scary to be hugged by people. And he came to me from the back and he hugged me and he embraced me. It's very easy to hug me. I'm like 5. You got the point. So he embraced me. And I looked at him and this man's face was beaming. He was smiling from ear to ear. And he says the famous question that no community here. What's that question? Do you remember me? And I'm like, oh God. I'm like, your face looks. Mike, I think I cut the mic. I said, your face looks very familiar. He said, 2 years ago, we were at this convention, pre-COVID, and you told me that I have the face of the Hafiz. You told me that you saw in my face the light of someone who knew the Quran, of someone that had the Quran sitting in their heart. He says, I literally just completed the Quran the other day. He said, do you know how much Quran I knew when you said that to me? He said, literally like the last 10 surah, like Surah Asr till Nas. And I was like, bro, I don't even know your name. But that idea is something that my teacher, rahmatullahi alayhi, taught me. See the light in people that they don't even see in themselves. People have an image of piety that's highly intimidating. It's what piety looked like in their grandparents. It's what piety looked like in their parents who sometimes were toxic with them. It's what piety sometimes looked like with people that might have ostracized us from the masajid. It's what piety looks like in a land far, far away. But when you show piety that sits inside of them, Allahumma, it's ringing, I heard. Allahumma ati nafsi taqwaha. The Prophet ﷺ used to say, oh Allah, give my nafs its own taqwa. Because taqwa, righteousness and piety looks beautifully unique in each and every single one of us. See it in yourself and see it in the people around you. Let yourself be a means of them seeing the light inside of themselves. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us from the people of piety. We beg of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this blessed gathering from the days of Allah with the people of Allah. We beg of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make it easy for our brothers and sisters in Gaza. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to feed their hunger. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to clothe them. We beg of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to dry the tears of the orphans. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to strengthen the hearts of the widows. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to handle the oppressors in the manner that's most befitting of them. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that this trial and tribulation for them and us be a means of us drawing near to His pleasure. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.